Medical Dilemmas with Dean. Welcome to Medical Dilemmas with Dean, the podcast with stories about the highs and the lows of going through medical issues. I'm your host and storyteller, Dean Balsarak, and today we'll be talking about my first and surprisingly, although very thankfully, only ambulance ride ever. It all started during third period one day in AP US History. I was sitting in the back of the class when I started to shake a little bit. I did not think much of it at first because it was rather cold out. However, the shivering did not stop. The shivers quickly turned into rigors, so I quietly raised my hand and waited patiently for my teacher to notice. For anyone who is wondering, rigors is a violent shaking quickly followed by an extremely high fever. It occurs when your body is trying to fight off an infection of some sort inside, and it is similar to shakes or shivering that you get whenever you have a fever. It gets so bad that I would probably send a Richter scale to their repair shop if I stood too close. After what felt like an eternity, my teacher noticed what was going on and let me go down to the nurse. The nurse then called my mother, who quickly left work, and she knew exactly what was happening. On her way to the school to pick me up, my mom contacted my doctors, and they directed her to go to the hospital immediately. She picked me up and rushed me to the Hasbro Children's Hospital emergency room. Once there, my vitals were taken, and they immediately put me on an IV to stabilize me and pump in some antibiotics. I was then admitted to a room where I was closely monitored and stayed for a couple of days. They were able to stabilize me with more IV antibiotics, and I started to feel much better. However, the problem was still not solved. The issue is that every so often, my bile ducts will get clogged for long enough for bacteria to form in the ducts. The bacteria then causes an infection, which causes the rigors and fevers that I get whenever I have a clog. If this goes untreated, then the infection can get into my bloodstream and cause sepsis, which is unfortunately the bottom step of the 6-foot staircase. However, because we were able to catch the infection quickly enough, the antibiotics were able to prevent the infection from causing too much harm. I also have had this happen enough to know what the symptoms are and how to identify exactly what is happening so that I can get the treatment quickly and avoid sepsis entirely. Once I had been fully stabilized, or as stabilized as I could be, my doctors in New York started to talk about how to transport me to New York Presbyterian Hospital from Hasbro Children's Hospital in Providence. This was because they wanted to unclog my bile ducts in New York since they knew my anatomy better, and they have a doctor who is really good at the procedure and has worked on me before, as I am a frequent visitor at New York Presbyterian Hospital. While I was in transportation, my doctors wanted my vitals to be monitored, as well as to keep the IV in my arm, since the root of the problem had not been fixed yet. To do this, they suggested that I ride in an ambulance, and my face lit up. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dean, I have never heard of anyone ever being excited about riding in an ambulance while they're sick. But hey, it was my first time, and I was not in excruciating pain or bleeding out, so the idea sounded really fun to me. I imagined riding in the ambulance on the stretcher and zooming down the highway all the way to New York with the siren blaring, lights flashing, and cars making way for me like I was the Queen of England. My inner 5-year-old shone through, and I could not wait for my first ambulance ride. However, if any of you listening have ever ridden in an ambulance before, you will know how naive I actually was. When the time came for me to go, 2 guys with a stretcher came into my hospital room to collect me. They helped me onto the stretcher and put some monitoring stickers on my chest and plugged them into a machine that showed my vitals. They then let me get as comfortable as I could and strapped me down to the stretcher. At first, the stretcher was not too bad, and it actually felt kind of comfortable as we walked down to the ambulance. We got outside, and this was when my excitement started to dim. The ambulance was one of those van ambulances, not a big one that looks like a box that you typically see in movies or speeding down the street. I did not think much of it though, and figured that it would be a similar experience as a bigger one. The two guys hoisted me into the ambulance, strapped me down a bit tighter, and then we started going to New York with one guy in the back with me and another guy driving. We got onto the highway, and I could not wait to weave between the cars with the siren and lights flashing, but nothing happened. I waited and waited, but still no siren, no lights, and no high speeds. My hope quickly vanished, especially when the guy in the back with me said that we will be there in about 3 hours, the same time it took when driving normally. This was also around the time when I started to realize that the ambulance stretcher was actually pretty low ranking on the comfort scale. Time began to pass rather slowly, and I fell asleep in defeat as I realized that my ambulance ride was not what I was expecting it to be. I woke up to the sound of the driver asking the guy in the back with me where the ambulance bay was at New York Presbyterian. Apparently, nobody had told them where to go, so I looked out the back window to see if I could help. I was able to identify where we were, and I knew exactly where to go because I had been there so many times. They then asked me if I knew where to go, and of course I groggily responded with, "Yeah, go up the street, straight through the light, and the ambulance bay will be on your left." The driver followed my directions, and he found the ambulance bay pretty quickly. He then pulled in, and they unloaded me into the cold New York air. However, we encountered another obstacle. Apparently, nobody had told them the code to the door into the hospital from the ambulance bay either, and we did not know what to do. First, they asked me if I knew the code, and since I am not the head of security there, I had no idea. Then, one guy began to look through the papers in his hands with me, while the other guy looked at the keypad. We could not find anything in the papers, but we heard a click and looked up at the guy at the keypad, who was now holding an open door. We asked him how the heck he managed to open it, and he responded, "Oh, the numbers of the code were the most worn out on the keypad, so I tried them, and it worked." Now that we had MacGyvered our way into the hospital, probably breaking a law or two, we walked in and encountered a 4-way intersection with nobody in sight. One way led to a door marked maintenance, however, so we were able to rule that one out pretty quick. Another to the emergency room, and another to an elevator bay. Again, not knowing what to do, one guy ran back to the ambulance to get more of my papers while I waited with the other guy. Eventually, a doctor came through the doors to the ER and asked what we were doing there, and the guy standing next to me said, "I think that this kid needs a liver transplant." Both my and the doctor's eyes opened wide, but I quickly denied this because not only have I already had one, but I did not feel like getting another one, or having to go through that again, nor was I even close to needing one. I have no idea why he said I needed a liver transplant, but it honestly didn't really surprise me at that point, seeing how uninformed they were of the situation. I told the doctor the name of my doctor at the hospital and explained to him the actual situation, and he directed us to go to the elevator bay and up to where a room was waiting for me. Finally, I was wheeled into the hospital room, got out of the torturously uncomfortable stretcher, and into the comfortable and cozy hospital bed. Although comfortable and cozy are two words I would never have thought I would use to describe a hospital bed, I desperately needed to lie down on something other than a wooden board. Once the nurse hooked me back up to everything, I immediately passed out and slept for as long as I possibly could. I will never forget this ambulance ride, not just because of the excitement or because it was my first ambulance ride, but for how ironic and hilarious it is that I, the patient with an IV in arm, just woke up from a nap, and with monitor stickers on, had to direct the professionals on where to go. I guess that my frequent hospital visits to Newark Presbyterian had finally paid off. That is it for this episode of Medical Dilemmas with Dean, and if you would like to hear more funny or crazy stories like this, Then subscribe and make sure to turn on notifications to stay up to date for the next episode. All of the music for this podcast is made by my brother, Steve, and the podcast is edited by myself. And I'll see you all next time for another Medical Dilemma with Dean.